Well, good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the next in our Grand Challenges lecture series from the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Keele University. My name is Jonathan Wassling. I have the pleasure of being Director of the Institute, as well as my day job as Pro-Vice Chancellor and Executive Dean of Natural Sciences at Keele. We've got a really exciting lecture this evening from one of our homegrown talent, Professor Cliff Stott, who's going to speak to us on the title, Are We All in It Together? Policing Human Rights, Security and Democracy During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Just as a way of by way of brief introduction to Cliff, for those who don't know Cliff, he's had a fascinating background, as you guessed from the title of his lecture. His research is very much into policing, police behaviour and crowd behaviour. And I suppose he cut his teeth in that area in research early on in the poll tax riots, also the English football riots and World Cup riots, looking at the interactions of crowd behaviour and policing there. More recently, he's been part of the Independent Police Commission Council in Hong Kong during the 2019 riots. And in the era of the rise of social media, he's used social media as a way of analysing and drawing conclusion as to those interactions between police and crowd behaviour. He's currently co-chair of the Security and Policing Group and a member of the SPI, the Special Interest Group, advising the current SAGE committee in the current coronavirus pandemic to government. He's had a fascinating personal journey. Cliff is currently Professor of Social Psychology here at Keele, and I had the pleasure of appointing him back in March 2016 from a position of Principal Research Fellow in Security and Justice in the School of Law at the University of Leeds. But before then, he started his academic career actually by leaving school at the age of 16 with no qualifications at all, but working his way up eventually into academia to a position of a chair here at Keele. Those of you who may have a bit of background on Cliff's personal background may have heard him on the Life Scientific broadcast earlier in June this year, where he talked in a really fascinating way about his personal journey to where he is now. So I think we're in for a real treat this evening. As usual, there's an opportunity at the end of the lecture to ask questions, and you can do that via the chat function, which is available on your screens. I'll collate those questions and pass those over to Cliff. Unfortunately, the interactions we're going to have aren't quite as fluid as they ordinarily would be in our home base at Keele, but hopefully we can have a really lively discussion. It's worked really well in previous series this year when we've been wholly online. We've got a really good audience. 145 people are registered this evening and online, and about 60% of you I know are students, a mixture of postgraduates and undergraduate students. Also, a very special welcome to our outside visitors to the Institute, who are from the wider Keele and regional community. So without further ado, I'm going to let Cliff take the stage and start his Grand Challenge lecture. So over to you now, Cliff. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. I'll push straight into the lecture to try to take advantage of as much time as we have available to us, because I want to leave questions, space for questions at the end. So I was hoping today to talk about three core issues, really, to give a short presentation to discuss how a programme of research and theory on the social psychology of riots and policing is interfaced dynamically with policy and practice in the context of the pandemic. I want to draw out some lessons about the value of behavioural and social sciences within the pandemic in helping to understand and address some of the complex challenges that the UK in particular has had to address. And I want to then just reflect at the end by suggesting some lessons we might take forward in terms of understanding how universities can position themselves to feed research meaningfully into the policy environments during future global challenges mass emergencies that unfortunately we will inevitably have to face. So Jonathan's already talked a little bit about me, Professor of Social Psychology. My work on crowds has already been quite influential in shaping policy and practice, particularly in relationship to the policing of crowds. And my research comes from a background of a focus on dialogue and trying to promote a human rights-based agenda to policing. And through that background expertise, I was drawn into the UK government's behavioural science subcommittee of SAGE. And during my time in that role, I co-created and I now co-lead the SAGE Policing and Security Group. So a little bit first then about the context within which all of my research takes place. Of course, I work out of a university, and I think it's fair to say that for more than a decade now, universities across the UK have been undergoing a restructuring exercise in terms of their research strategy. That has been about reorienting research towards the challenges that we are going to be facing in the 21st century. Because when we think about why we do what we do, it's important to reflect that we need to produce knowledge that helps address some of those challenges. The research sector in the UK has to be relevant, and it has to be relevant in a way that helps us to understand and address those challenges. And my arrival at Keele in 2016 was a time where Keele was already on that journey and had begun to restructure in the post-Rev 2014 environment, and is now organised around 3 core strategic themes of global health, social inclusion and sustainable futures. And within that agenda of sustainable futures, there is a theme about creating responsible, sustainable communities and governance. And my research fits very much in that area, because it's very much about understanding how to create democratic institutions, democratic forms of policing, and maintaining a level of democracy and peace in an ever-changing world in light of these challenges. Now, since arriving here, I worked with others to produce a research centre called KPAC, Keele Policing Academic Collaboration. And the mission here was to establish a regional framework of collaboration with external partners, in particular the police and crime commissioners. And we work very closely with those partners at a regional level to produce research of international significance around the issues relevant to policing. And it's fair to say that the research agenda that we have in KPAC tends to challenge conventional constructions about the nature of what is traditionally considered research in the university context. We have a strong focus on interdisciplinarity and a very strong focus on doing research that has impact. But in order to achieve that, we move away from a kind of notion that we're just here to do science, and that science is all about focusing on good methods and epistemology to produce valid theory, but rather to take the idea that actually we do research to produce knowledge. And we want to co-produce that knowledge with our partners so that we can create effective pathways to impact that allows those partners to adjust and dynamically incorporate that research and knowledge in the context of our dynamic and very challenging circumstances that are faced by the organisations that we work with. And we've been reasonably successful in that endeavour, securing projects worth in excess of 3 million since we set it up in late 2016. Now, obviously, we were then geared up and producing this research and developing this framework of partnerships, and we entered the first of those major global crises that everybody's been working towards to try to gear up and be ready for over the last decade. But I don't think anybody really expected to be dealing with it so early and with such profound impacts. And of course, while the biological threat posed by COVID it is and has to be a primary focus of analysis, the modelling and understanding how the virus spreads, develops and indeed mutates now, what is often less salient are the considerations of the security implications of the global epidemiology. And that's partly because of the nature of the disease. We have to recognise that the threat is because of the characteristics of that virus, that it's highly contagious, that its mode of transmission is airborne, that it affects in really powerful ways specific age ranges, and that has a very high fatality rate. And because of all of those things, it has this very profound impact, particularly in relationship to how the disease overwhelms the healthcare system in any country, however geared up it is. There's no healthcare system in the world that can deal with that level of demand created by the disease. And really, we were ill prepared as a society, despite the fact that we had lots and lots of off-the-shelf civil contingency arrangements. But they were effectively for the wrong kind of disease, that we were geared up for flu rather than SARS-type respiratory virus. And we should never lose sight of the fact that in the run-up to the pandemic in 2020, we were geared up, and we were testing and rolling out civil contingency preparations for Brexit, and that ultimately left us with our eye off the ball at this critical juncture. And in the absence of a cure or no vaccination, behaviour was our only weapon. It was the only way that we could control that pandemic. And that has big implications then, because in the context of the international arrangements around which the global society was preparing itself and was pre-prepared for a pandemic of this kind, there were a series of international treaties and protocols in place that obligated society to begin to address these behavioural issues, to start to control behaviour as the only way in which the virus and the pandemic could actually be controlled. So what we started to see in January 2020 onwards then was this unprecedented germ governance response from governments internationally. And what we saw in that was that international norms started to push and pull nation states in the direction of highly securitized lockdowns. Now, these highly securitized lockdowns had profound implications for democracy that we see all over the world. We see populist, totalitarian societies starting to utilize the pandemic as an opportunity to pass through laws, to cancel elections, to grab the reins of power, to engage in ways that started to interact with pre-existing conflicts in really, really troubling ways. And it's then therefore no surprise that as early as April, Guterres from the UN Secretary General was describing the pandemic as a human rights crisis. And what we have to recognise then is that these profound crises were ahead of us once this pandemic started to grip. And just as a reflection on this, I think it's in some senses impossible to understand the invasion of Capitol Hill in the wake of the election in America without considering it as a consequence of the pandemic. After all, the very issue that these people used to legitimize their attack on Capitol Hill was the idea of a fraudulent election that was made possible because of the high level of voting by mail that was required because that election took place in the context of a pandemic. So what we see here is that these threats to the social order, these threats to democracy are fundamental to how we need to understand and reflect upon the pandemic. It's not just about the virus, it's about the effect of the control measures and the implications that has for the stability and security of democracy itself. So CAPAC was in the mix, as it were, set up and ready to go when this pandemic landed, and our expertise then was able to start then to reflect on the potential threats that were facing the UK, and they were diverse, interconnected and dynamic. And whilst not inevitable, there was, and I would argue still remains, a serious threat of widespread rioting. And this is primarily because the pandemic and its surrounding control measures amplify threats to social cohesion and public order. And we wanted to be as proactive as we possibly could be from the research centre to try to liaise and engage government in a way that would help to put in place mitigations that could try to steer us through the pandemic in a way that didn't see that propensity for conflict develop. And one of the first papers that we produced through our participation in SPI-B was a paper on the likelihood of rioting and the measures that could be put in place to try to mitigate that. And indeed, the very invitation to participate in SPI-B was because one of the first considerations of the UK government in the context of the pandemic was the potential for riots to develop. So it was a key policy consideration right at the outset of what was going on. And we argued in that paper that riots are not inevitable, but that they require certain social, psychological processes to be in place. One of those is that there has to be a sense of illegitimacy and grievance. A group or a community has to experience something as being done or denied to them by another group, a powerful group, the government or the police, unjustifiably. And this grievance has to be at a group level. It has to be understood as something that's happening to us as a group or a community. And then it's necessary to be able to identify an agent or an outgroup that's seen as the source of that grievance. And in the context of riots, that's almost invariably the police, because rioting requires a them to target in the physical location in which it takes place. And we were in a very advantageous position to advise government on this issue because we just completed a 3-year, £1 million ESRC funded study on the dynamics through which the 2011 riots in England spread. And we know through that research and other research, the perceptions of the illegitimacy of state and of the police are central to why people riot. And we recognise that during the pandemic, the broader legitimacy of policing would be under constant challenge. And there's a very real danger in that context that minor confrontations in one location can be seen by others in different locations as indicative of wider illegitimacies in the relationship that they share with the authority, and the disorder can begin to escalate and spread. So we understood this from this research, and we started to feed this understanding and this research into government in the form of recommendations. And those recommendations were built about trying to think about solutions, trying to think about mitigations. And for us, that mitigation was to ensure that the police were empowered as they possibly could be to build policing from within communities who were seeking some kinds of resolutions to the difficulties that they would inevitably be faced with in the context of the pandemic and its required lockdown. And what we urged and encouraged was for police forces to invest heavily in partnership building through neighbourhood policing, to build key individual networks, and to undertake ongoing sentiment and impact assessments at the neighbourhood level. And the idea being then that if conflict does break out, they've got the capacity to draw on those resources, draw on those partnerships, draw on those networks to help de-escalate the situation so that they don't fall into the trap of escalating those conflicts inadvertently through interventions by police officers who are not from that area, who come in to try to restore order, but inadvertently initiate the dynamics of escalation. So this was part of the early contribution that we made. But of course, in the context of the pandemic, one of the key characteristics of it was this rapidly changing context. We were making these recommendations in March, and it was towards the end of March then that we started to encounter the critical week in wave 1. Now, you recall during those early phases, there was this very controversial issue about the government's position, and the concept of herd immunity emerged. And partly what I experienced certainly here was an issue of change that happened in an unprecedented way to a scale and intensity that in my 55 years I've never experienced in the past. the level of change was profound and the speed of that change was profound. But I want to make the case that it wasn't a change brought about by government. It was actually a change brought about by us, the community, the people. Because if you recall, on the 12th of March, Boris Johnson made his first kind of major announcement. But it didn't go that far. It didn't end sporting fixtures. It wasn't really full lockdown. But immediately, the day after that speech, the Premier League and the Elite Football and the English Football League closed down, that they stopped playing on the Friday. During that weekend, we saw the first so-called panic buying, the rush on supermarkets, where all of a sudden all of the toilet paper disappeared and we were left with these empty shelves. By Monday, then, we were looking at a situation where universities, I remember coming to work on that Monday and having to face considerations about closing down Kiel on that Monday. And by Tuesday, we were effectively in a position where the university was closing. By Wednesday, it was becoming clear that the schools were going to have to close down. And then on Friday, Boris Johnson came back to the podium and we went into this brave new world of the full lockdown. And my argument here is that it was public norms that pushed us into that brave new world. It was not government leadership. Government didn't really, I don't think, want us to go there in the first instance. It was geared up and ready to take us there, but I think it felt very reticent about going that far. But it was clear after they made that initial announcement that we could go further, and by Friday we did. But then that started to then sort of introduce us to mass emergency psychology. What is that psychology? How does it work at societal level in the context of this kind of radical change in the way in which we were forced to live our lives? Well, one of the core and dominant narratives here is this notion of irrationality, and captured most powerfully in the concept of panic buying. And everybody was starting to talk about panic buying and the shelves are empty and so on and so forth. But what we have to recognise here, there was nothing irrational about that. We all knew at that point we were going to be forced to stay at home for a considerable amount of time. It was uncertain how long that would be. And normally we'd be going to work. And there's this just lovely, it's probably not the most polite statistic to put on the table at this point in time. But basically, if we go to work, we tend to go to the toilet at work. But if we're not going to work, we have to go to the toilet at home. So we need to buy more toilet paper, and much more toilet paper than the supermarkets were geared up for. They were not prepared for that level of supply and demand. So it just didn't match. And what ends up happening then, of course, is that the stock runs out. It was not illogical mass panic. It was just supply and demand. They didn't match up. People were just buying small additional amounts of items, but the demand, the uplift in demand, couldn't meet that supply. And this media representation of panic and panic buying and selfishness actually amplified the problem, because people started thinking, well, if everybody else is trying to buy it, I've got, oh God, I better go out and buy it. There's nothing illogical about that at all. It's a part of a narrative of the irrationality of mass psychology that our work seeks to challenge, because mass psychology is not about that. That's not how psychology operates in the environment of a mass emergency. People are very rational and logical and seek to form cultures of resilience in the context of a mass emergency. But nonetheless, this dominant narrative of selfishness and irrationality has prevailed throughout the pandemic. We've even seen new nouns come about. The COVID-idiot starts to be a narrative of how these so-called selfish people carry on doing things that they're not supposed to do, that are a threat to public safety. So we see representations of crowded tube trains. But effectively what was going on here was that these were working class people who weren't able to stay off work and still had to continue to go into work. And indeed, they had to go into work on limited public transport because there were not as many trains running as there are normally. So they were forced into crowded environments and then effectively pathologized in the media for having to go to work. So these media representations and narratives effectively blamed and stigmatized people for being poor and working class, and represented what were material constraints as as free choice. And again, when we look at the data, we look at the evidence, and we look at the patterns, that narrative is simply unsustainable in what it was that was leading people not to be able to comply. It was not a lack of compliance, it was a lack of capacity to adhere because they needed to go to work, they needed money, people needed to survive in this kind of context. But what we started to see then was this very dominant narrative of policing the COVIDiots. But this policing of the COVIDiots was occurring in a context of major social change, where the normal patterns of policing and the normal ways in which people would draw limits about what isn't legitimate to police had changed fundamentally. For example, you would, in any other circumstance, find it absolutely outrageous if the police tried to prevent you from going out for a walk in the country. I mean, this is a major intrusion into our rights and liberties as citizens of this country. And this is also going on in a context where there's this really ambiguous territory between the law itself, these really strict laws, and what the government was telling us in terms of guidance. And there was often a vast gap between those things. You know, what constitutes exercise, what constitutes a substantial meal, all these kinds of things are really, really ambiguous, a very difficult environment for the police to police in. And indeed, when we start to look at the research in this context, what we start to see is that the entire agenda around enforcement is really not substantiated by the scientific evidence. That the data starts to talk about the fact that, of course, enforcement clearly has a deterrent effect. But it suggests that this is chiefly because it sends normative signals to the public about expected behaviours. And that people are adhering not through fear of a punishment, but through self-regulation, because they identify with what they see as these legitimate shared goals that we have as a community who are in this struggle together. So the law isn't functioning simply because it's a deterrent, but because it conveys this normative dimension about what it is and isn't appropriate to do. And that the enforcement itself in that context is largely incidental to whether or not people will actually adhere. It's not a question of some breakdown of morality. And certainly we will never police our way out of a pandemic. But within that, then, we still see the pre-COVID patterns of disproportionality. That in the context of the pandemic, the patterns of racial disproportionality were writ large. That you're more likely to be policed, to be fined if you're black relative to white. And young black men in particular were prone to policing. And being punished in this context. So we started to try to understand how we could apply our research further into this broader territory of police legitimacy and illegitimacy in this shifting environment of constantly evolving change, where uncertainty was the core feature, that we didn't really understand what was confronting us. We'd never been in this territory before. How can we make our research apply in the context of such profound novelty? And we did so by, of course, drawing on the data and looking to others to provide data about what was going on. And there's no doubt that in the context of the pandemic, that one of the most fundamental positive contributions the government has made is to introduce furloughing. And we've just seen an extension of it in the budget today, that furloughing has had a profound impact on the social relations that we have managed to maintain through this pandemic. And I think we'd be in a fundamentally different place if we had not had that financial intervention. But nonetheless, the poor and ethnic minorities have taken the brunt of this pandemic, both in terms of their well-being and in terms of the economic conditions. So what we've seen is the amplification of structural inequality, that you are far more likely to die. Indeed, you're twice as likely to die from COVID if you live in an area of the most deprived communities relative to the most affluent. The financial implications are much more profound if you come from a geographical area of socio-economic deprivation. So what we were seeing was that the structural conditions that we know to be associated with riots, creating these conditions under which groups could quite reasonably see themselves as facing grievances disproportionately to others, was starting to really hit home in the context of the pandemic, just at the point where we began to lift. And in that context of lifting, we started to see further change, which brought further questions about what was the legitimacy of policing? What was it legitimate to police? What was it not legitimate to police? And essentially what we ended up with was a circumstance where the only really thing that the police could enforce was flagrant violations. And by that, we mean large-scale public assemblies. And by that, we essentially mean raves or block parties and so on and so forth. And this was occurring at a point at which the psychology of togetherness around which we built the initial response to the lockdown was starting to disintegrate. You'll all remember the Barnard Castle incident as perhaps the strongest indicator, but there were also things there about changing the messaging, that we'd moved from this very simple messaging to stay alert, and the ridiculing of that messaging and its inherent ambiguity. What we were also looking at was a situation of potential hyper-local lockdowns. You recall that when we came out of the initial lockdown, there was the retention of the lockdown in Leicester. And in that context, of course, we have to recognise that the pandemic was more profound in areas of socio-economic deprivation. Those areas had higher proportions of black and ethnic minority communities in them. So the areas that were more likely to be infectious were also areas of ethnic diversity. And we started to see racist groups beginning to exploit that to try to amplify racial tensions in the context, and blaming minority populations for leaving these situations in lockdown. You recall also the wide spread disturbances that grew up in the context of the Black Lives Matter campaign that began with the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol. And how in that context the police commander who stood back and allowed that to happen was vilified, because at the same time there was this political and ideological push towards enforcement, that somehow the police were accused of going too soft on these demonstrations. And we saw these cascade out in a context where other things were happening that could have acted as serious catalyst events. So, for example, in North London, in late June, 2 young black women were stabbed to death. The police did not respond initially. They treated it simply as a missing persons. The brother found the 2 bodies in a local park. Subsequent to that, a few weeks later, the police officers who had arrived on that scene had made social media footage on their phones of the murdered bodies and were passing them around each other in their police unit. And this was brought out. So in this context of structural inequality, in this context where the only thing being policed were these mass gatherings, we were seeing these potential catalyst events that could have precipitated out into wider conflict and disorder. And where we look at that summer, I think we labour under the misunderstanding that there wasn't disorder, because of course there was. There was quite a lot of serious disorder in London and other parts of the country where confrontations developed between police and people. And I just want to show you one extract from one of those conflicts in Brixton in North London.
The police are getting run out of hand. The police are getting run. People think it's excuses. People think it's good. The police are getting run out of hand. The police.
So you can see very clearly the tension, the conflict, the destruction. Now, however one wants to look at that, I think it has all of the hallmarks of what I would characterise as a riot. That there were these pockets of disturbance going on in different parts of the country regularly through the summer. In part, what's significant about them is that they didn't spread. In the way that we saw in 2011. And our research has been focusing on that issue. We've been developing a case study around the policing of one particularly important carnival in the north of England that's helping us to understand how some of the recommendations that we made to police forces were implemented and how they flowed into a more dialogue focused potential for intervention that we argue at some level played some role in helping to alleviate the potentiality for those riots to spread into other parts of the country. Now, I just want to conclude in the few minutes that I have left to talk then about the politics of knowledge and that how this role of giving scientific advice in the context of the pandemic has to be seen in a very political way that isn't just about our ability as neutral scientists to draw on research and theory to provide kind of neutral advice and knowledge to the government, who then argue that they're acting in line with that scientific guidance. And I think that in order to do this, one of the really powerful questions that we have to ask here has to be framed by this question: has the UK's response been successful? And can we really answer that question with a yes when Britain has the highest COVID-19 death rate per capita in the world at one point? You know, that hundreds of thousands of people have died in this pandemic. We've been here playing a role as scientific advisors to government, and that's the outcome. Can that be seen as successful? Can the government's response be seen as successful? Now, we see in this context a constant narrative of a government pushing us towards enforcement, that enforcement somehow is the solution, because implicit in that is the argument that the problem are these naughty members of the public who don't conform to public health guidance. And that's really, why we're getting the spread, and that's really why things are going wrong. But ultimately, when we look at that enforcement issue, what we have to recognise is that enforcement is largely ineffectual. Not only do we know it doesn't really drive why people adhere, but it also is the case that the vast majority of people who are fined haven't paid those fines. They're not going to pay those fines. They're going to dispute them in the courts. And we're already looking at a criminal justice system that is in crisis, that even prior to the pandemic was in crisis. And now, because of the pandemic, the backlog in people processing through the courts is leading to situations where serious crimes are not going to be tried for 2 to 3 years. And on top of that, we're flooding in people who are disputing these fines and adding to the potentiality for a crisis in the criminal justice system, where the rule of law itself is put into question and is brought under threat. For circumstances where we see, for example, you will recall those two young women who were fined for travelling 5 miles to go for a walk. So this issue is not just one of enforcement, it's also about the legitimacy of authority. We know that the perception of the illegitimacy of authority is one of the core drivers of whether people will riot or not. So this narrative of enforcement is contrary in many ways to how we should be thinking about the problem and what the scientific evidence tells us about how we should deal with the problem. And what we also see is that now at last we have a good news story. And we have a good news story about the rollout of the vaccine. I am delighted. I am going to get my vaccine tomorrow. I mean, what a fantastic opportunity to find some kind of shielding to this pandemic that is putting us back on the road to recovery. But look how it's functioned. It's functioned through the NHS. And because it's functioned through the NHS, it's built up through the GP network. It's built up locally. But where is test and trace? What's happened to the £22 billion investment in test and trace, which didn't come up from the bottom, was brought in by corporations from the top, and has been an abject failure and continues to be an abject failure, and I would argue has been a main contributor to why it is that we're in the situation that we are with such high death rates. So is it the case that the government has been guided by the science? Well, there are many that argue that you can't just follow the science, because science is never neutral in a context like this. It can't be neutral because government is making the decisions, and those decisions are fundamentally political. I don't personally agree with them. I think a lot of the decisions that the government have been made have been fundamentally wrong, damaging, and cause more difficulties than they've actually resolved. But I am on a body that advises government, and I play an important role, I believe, and I want to retain that opportunity. But you will have seen that perhaps others have taken a different path, and one of the most important in there is the Independent Sage Group. And you'll see a weekly podcast by that group, openly critical of the government position. And I think in the context of the pandemic, one can even see Indie Sage as almost like the official opposition now in relationship to government decision making around the pandemic. But for me, I think it's also important to recognise that what we are doing as scientists is liaising in a complex government environment where different departments are struggling to cope with the pandemic and trying to make decisions, and people in those departments are trying to make decisions. And it's important to ensure that we get our research, our science, our theory into the mix. And I think that a lot of what we've been doing here is not so much advising governments what to do, but actually helping them to understand that other things would be really bad to do. In a sense, putting the brakes on more so than pushing decisions in particular directions, although we know that our work has pushed in particular directions. So the issue here is really about how do you sit in relationship to government political decision making as a scientist in relationship to this broader framework of decision making and outcomes. And also in the context of the pandemic, we've been working to liaise with our policing partners to help them to address some of the local challenges, for example, working with Warwickshire Police on the policing of protests in relationship to the building of HS2, trying to promote a human rights position. But for us now, the issue is about not what's gone on in the past, but what's coming down the road. The vaccine isn't a panacea. We're going to see variants. We're going to see the requirement for localized lockdown and outbreak control. We're going to see government decision making, potentially taking away rights to protest. It's currently illegal to protest in the UK. We're seeing a massive impact on our economy. We're going to see increasing levels of social inequality. That's going to feed into increased levels of police disproportionality. And there's issues here around inequalities growing up around vaccine certification and so on. So taking these things all together, we are far from through this pandemic yet. And in fact, I would suggest that we are just in the mix of the end of the first wave of the crises that higher education is beginning to gear itself up for. And I think that we can learn some really powerful lessons through thinking through how science has played a role in relationship to COVID-19. And just to conclude then, I think my reflection would be that the KPAC has provided a good platform through which our research has been able to interface dynamically with policy and practice in the context of COVID-19. And I would assert that our work is helping to understand and address some of the complex challenges that UK has had to address. Our work has been impactful at a government level, regardless of my personal views about whether or not the government decision making is right. And as a consequence, it's important to recognise that in the context of this kind of mass emergency, social and behavioural science has a key role to play. These have been issues about behaviour, and our scientific knowledge in that domain has been important and continues and will remain important moving forward. And for me, that suggests that and emphasises the importance of the decisions by higher education institutions in the UK to start reorienting thematically such that their research agendas and strategies are oriented towards these future global challenges and mass emergencies that are going to be coming at us through climate change over the next 20 to 30 years. But one thing I think is profoundly true of what's happened in this pandemic: we are clearly not in it all together. And as a consequence, there has to be the recognition that science is not some neutral endeavour, but something that has to be built around moral values and adapt rapidly in order to interface with the political dynamics of the global crises in the complex political landscape that we populate. So thank you. I hope that was a good framework for thinking, and I look forward to some of the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Cliff, for that really stimulating and fascinating tour. I know with a lot of our lectures, we can reflect on probably timescales a little bit more historic than this, in terms of looking about 5, 10, 20, 50, maybe hundreds of years in terms of our perspectives. But this is a huge amount of history that we've all experienced, remarkably, pretty much in the past year. It's almost as if we've undergone 10, 20 years change in a short, a very compressed time span, and we've all experienced that. And I think looking back at some of those events that were only 12 months ago, it's amazing how the world has moved on in that time, and that was reflected really clearly in some of the remarks you made in your lecture. So thanks a lot for that. We have loads of questions, but some of them are clustering together, and I'm going to try and pull together some of the themes as much as I can. Please feel free still, though, to add questions to the Q&A bar, and I will try and get as many of them through to Cliff as possible. If you can keep your questions really short and to the point, that helps me read them quickly, and also Cliff, I'm sure you'll keep your responses relatively brief, so that we can make sure we can move on with as much material as possible. So we've got a period of questions now. Just while we're waiting for some more to come in, and it slightly relates to one or two of the themes of the questions coming forward. I think you painted a very fair picture in terms of where we are in this country, but I wonder if you might be able to just cast or give us a reflection on your wider knowledge about an international perspective on this, in terms of other countries, in particular. And it's true that we've not seen maybe some degree some of the outbreaks of rioting or wider crowd disruption that some countries have seen, although I think overall they've not been widespread around the world, but certainly elsewhere they've been a bit more prominent. But also there's very, very different policing structures, their attitudes to that, completely different forms of society, democracy, versus totalitarian systems, etc. So it's maybe a broad question, but I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on where on some of the different approaches that we've seen in other countries, and whether they've been either more successful or less successful.
Obviously, our work is very focused on policing and enforcement, and one of the papers that we were asked to work on within the security and policing group was a paper on enforcement-based approaches, and we have the opportunity of working with a guy called Professor Carl Roberts, who's the WHO advisor on policing, and he's been very useful at helping us to build that kind of international picture. But what we can argue from the evidence that's out there is enforcement just doesn't work. It doesn't make any difference. That you can look even in the European context and compare, say, for example, France and the UK. The levels of enforcement are much higher in France. By April they'd issued upwards of 1 million fixed penalty notices. You could go to prison for 10 years if you violate some of the COVID restrictions and so on. But the rates of transmission have not really been that different between the UK and France. So what that just anecdotal example gives us the opportunity to reflect on is that when it comes to it, you don't police your way out of a pandemic. Policing is really incidental. So why put yourself through a situation where you require that level of enforcement? And what we are also seeing is correspondingly in those societies where enforcement has been heavy, trust in government is very, very low. So what they're suffering is poor uptake of the vaccine. So when the society then gets into a position where it's got a route out, that large sections of that society are so alienated from the state that they don't trust it anymore. And then they don't buy into the potential solution. And then we're all at a global level left with these pockets within which the virus retains strength and through which the virus might then mutate. And that's our biggest challenge now. Our biggest challenge is how do we deal over the next few years with the potentiality for these mutations to flood back into the UK and force us back into another lockdown because the vaccines that we've got are not responsive enough.
Okay, thanks, Cliff. I've got loads of other questions, but I'm not going to be selfish at this point, so I'm going to just take some of the ones from the chat coming in here and try and bunch them together. Possibly slightly related to this. I mean, the first question is a wider question, just about the extent to which the current situation might lead to a greater scrutiny of democracy as a sustainable system of government, and possibly even looking at other forms of government in either direction. Will there be greater scrutiny, and will that lead to pressure for maybe us to think about organising governance of society differently?
Well, I think it's a very, very powerful question, one which that concerns me in terms of my thinking about developing this entire research agenda, is that given the level of transition that we need to go through as a society to cope with the coming mass emergencies that will flow from climate change, that we've in a sense experienced, as Jonathan pointed out there, the level of change that we've gone through in such a short period of time is in a sense the kind of change that we need to go through in order to cope with climate change. Like, I haven't driven my car very much for nearly a year now, which is precisely where we need to be. We need to be working from home, and all these kinds of things are the kinds of changes that we need to sustain. But is it going to be possible to get through that change and come out on the other side with something that we still can hold on to, that is what we call at the moment liberal democracy? And I think liberal democracy is a good way of organising politically, but there are surrounding us at a global level sincere and powerful threats to the stability of that liberal democracy, as we've seen in terms of the invasion of Capitol Hill, where the mainstay of liberal democracy and indeed capitalism itself in the context of the global economy, its part, its main kind of structures of governance were literally invaded and placed under threat. I mean, I can't pretend for a moment that I have an answer to a question like that, but I would reinforce the idea that it's a very powerful question that we need to attend to. How can we get through this crisis and still enjoy some form of liberal democracy on the other side of it?
Thanks, Cliff. A few questions around the police and the effect of enforcement, recognising that there have been instances where that over enforcement has led to a breakdown of trust, and wider issues that you've alluded to in your talk this evening. And the question really is about, how can the police work to build back trust here in a way that you would reflect would be a more healthy relationship? Is that simply just withdrawing completely from the equation, or is it by doing things differently?
Not so much doing things differently, but investing in the policing of investing in neighbourhood policing, building policing from within, recognising the idealistic principles of the British policing model, which is based on policing through consent of the public, for the public, by the public. And that means policing from within communities. And there's this big push now towards diversity in the police, because the idea is you get more diverse workforce that can connect more intimately with the communities that are being policed. But within that, there also has to be a structural and reorganisation within the police, because over the last essentially 20 years, neighbourhood policing has been torn apart. And we need to reinvest back into neighbourhood policing so that neighbourhood police officers can work in partnerships with local communities to build trust and confidence, and to build policing from within those communities in a way that's responsive to the sensitivities and requirements of those communities at a local level. And for me, that's where I think the solution lies. It lies in partnership, it lies in dialogue, and it lies in embedding us back into a model of community-based policing.
So I think it's related to that, and I guess it's a very brief answer, but one questioner just wants to know what proportion of police officers said to come from socioeconomically deprived backgrounds. I mean, it relates exactly to what you're saying, in the sense that they've got to be representative of the people, on behalf of the people. So how good is that representation at the moment?
Well, it's very, very poor, very weak. We've just been undertaking a funded ESRC project looking at police citizen encounters, and in particular the issue of procedural fairness and legitimacy in the policing of marginalised communities. And one of the things that research has brought home to us is how most of the police who police where crime is at its most prevalent are not from those communities. They're born elsewhere, and they're policing from the outside in, and not connected to those communities. And there are many in the police who argue that the reforms that are currently ongoing in terms of requiring police officers to have a degree before they become a police officer is going to make that problem worse, because people from those communities are less likely to get access to higher education, and therefore less likely to become police officers. So it could amplify the problem. So there's some very real issues there that we need to understand in terms of how we diversify and make the workforce of the police more representative. But I don't think it's just about diversification. It's about embedding police officers into those communities by investing in the development of neighbourhood policing.
So there's a question about sense of sort of community togetherness, and I guess that relates also to legitimacy of policing as well in those areas. But to what extent do you think that the messaging regarding Black ethnic minorities being more vulnerable to COVID and potentially willingness to take vaccines and and so on, that sort of messaging actually can lead to a loss of togetherness in society? And actually reproducing and reinforcing some of those divisions rather than bringing people together?
Well, I think the way to bring people together is to recognise the inequality of the structural relations we exist in. It's all well and good saying we should not talk about, don't mention racism, because it divides people. Unfortunately, people are divided, and they're divided because society itself is systemically and structurally racist. And until we start to address that, we won't solve it. There was a really, really powerful documentary on the BBC last night that several people here may have seen, but it brings home again how COVID is the amplifier of inequality, and those inequalities are riven into our society. They are about class as well as race, but because race and class are intersectional in British society. It has left Black and Asian and other minority populations in our country far more vulnerable to the negative impacts of COVID. Unless we address the inequalities, the health inequalities that have led that reality to emerge, we will not bring people together in our society. We will only reinforce division.
Got a question from a current serving police officer who's worked through the pandemic, and their reflection is that their experience was actually the vast majority of the public supported the actions that were taken by the police and their colleagues. And I guess it's just a reflection about how do we, and this is talking obviously very personally from the questioner, ensure we maintain the trust and cooperation of those members of the public who disagreed with our actions going forward. So I think a real sort of reaching out there in terms of from the, the other side of the fence. But I mean, important observation as well that their experience was that the vast majority were compliant and supported their actions.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's two things to be said there. I think first is just to reinforce the point that's made in the question itself, that the real story here about what's gone on in the pandemic is the massive amount of adherence to public health guidance. The vast bulk of people were fully on board with what needed to be done. And that was really why I made the example of what took us into lockdown in the first place. It wasn't the government, it was us. We wanted to go into lockdown because we knew it was the right thing to do. And the vast bulk of the population want that. And I think that still remains the case now. And why the story of the transgressors is so incidental, yet it's so salient. Steve Reicher, for example, that really powerful outcome that he had in terms of the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, getting them to focus on the stories of people who were conforming rather than the people who weren't. To reinforce that we are all in this together, to hear others who are doing that as well. But I think the other challenge that the police have found is the competing legitimacies, that balancing different communities' perceptions of what needs to be done. So the need to enforce against one community can lead that community to feel aggrieved, but at the same time the failure to enforce that transgression can leave another community aggrieved at the fact that the police have not acted to enforce. So again, the police have been in a really difficult and tricky situation trying to balance different legitimacies, and to police in that context has been profoundly difficult. And I think from a theoretical point of view, one of the most interesting things about it, because police legitimacy lies at the heart of the theoretical work that we do, and seeing this rapidly changing social context has helped us to understand a little bit more clearly about the dynamic nature of how it is that people come to see legitimacy in policing in the first place.
Thanks, Cliff. I'm just going to we're going to have to wind up shortly now, coming towards the end. I've just got a couple more questions, and then we'll move towards the end of this session. Slightly different tact here, and a reflection from one questioner that recognises that the sort of rioting or maybe less responsible behaviour has actually moved away from the physical street or the town centre or the city, actually to the area of social media, and that a lot of that behaviour is moved into a different sphere. And we've seen a lot of debate about regulation of speech, taking down tweet. Any reflections on that? I mean, it's a policing issue in the sense of policing, I guess, in a much more generic term in terms of behaviours, but it's not one dealt with by, or most regularly by, the normal police service. Any reflections on that? And maybe that's a healthy thing. Maybe we're actually getting their ideas and debates out there in a way that's at least not violent to each other.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, Jonathan. I think, obviously issues here around freedom of speech and social media use and the hostility therein with trolling and so on and so forth. But if I may just reflect on that question in a slightly different way, in the sense of the changing patterns of criminality. And I think that's something else that the pandemic taught us. One of the features of the landscape in policing in the first lockdown was the immediate impact it had on normal patterns of crime. That crime as it existed pre-pandemic just changed fundamentally. But other crimes started to come to the fore. So online fraud, domestic violence, child abuse become much more amplified through the changing social conditions that we were forced to go through in the context of the pandemic. So I think one of the things that we have to recognise here is that moving forward, the changing conditions under which we're going to be required to live are going to bring fundamental changes to the nature of criminality itself. And the police also need to dynamically respond to that in ways that start to weave together an architecture that allows us to deal with that criminality. But at the same time, that fundamental problem is still there, is that how do we manage this in a way that maintains democratic freedoms of expression, assembly, consciousness, and so on. And that for me is one of the core challenges. How do we come out of this with a notion of a rights-based democracy still intact?
So that just the last question, I'm afraid, we're running out of time now, but I'm just going to take one final question, and it relates to the remarks you made earlier in terms of, in theory, we were prepared, but in reality, the off-the-shelf civil contingency preparations didn't serve us well in this particular instance. As a professor of infectious diseases, I could give a perspective and answer on this, but I'd be interested in your perspective from maybe a policing, but also a wider perspective. So we know that governments do have massive civil contingency operations, and they go through huge planning exercises, they go through simulation exercises on a regular basis. But that off-the-shelf manual didn't maybe operate as well as it could have done. What's your perspective on that, Cliff?
Well, we could talk for hours on it, I'm afraid, Jonathan. But I think what our research has been able to do is to enjoy the participation of local partners who've been talking us on a regular basis about their experience of delivering that civil contingency response. And there are some clear patterns in what they've had to go through. First of all, we could never have been prepared for a civil contingency of this duration. All of the civil contingency planning that we've done has been short scale, been for, like floods or whatever. These things would go on for days or weeks, not years. So in a sense, we could never have been prepared for that at the local level. But one of the key themes that comes out of the data that we get is the top-down nature of the government's response to this, that has systematically disempowered the local resilience forums to deliver an effective civil contingency response. So, for example, a really powerful example, in the early stages, the government was requiring the local resilience forums to gear up to deliver food to people who were sheltering, because they couldn't go to the supermarkets and stuff like that. So they geared themselves up and they were ready to receive this food and deliver it. But when it was delivered in wholesale form. So instead of getting food parcels to then take out and deliver, which they geared themselves up for, they then had to break this wholesale food down into the food parcels, and they simply weren't prepared for that. So they couldn't deliver the food. So it's just simple things like that, the sort of top down, this is what the government's going to do, without empowering the local resilience forums to do it for themselves. And if they had done that and built a bottom up response, I don't believe we would be in any way, shape or form in the position that we are now, with the rate of deaths or the absence of test track and to test and trace the community people, because it's come from the top down, and that interface between central government and local government has been a key feature of the landscape of this pandemic that we need to learn serious lessons about. because we should be building this response at the local level, as we have been doing with the vaccine, and look how effective that's been.
Yeah, I think that's an important reflection with respect to the vaccine. And I mean, there are other facets that I think are intimately linked to the nature of the virus itself and its pathology and progression. And I think probably a lot of civil contingency and actually health contingency was based on models around classic flu, and the biggest and impacted is undoubtedly on the fact that we weren't prepared for a disease that had high transmissibility in the absence of symptoms. So the asymptomatic transmission was extremely high, and even when symptomatic symptoms did develop, that transmission could occur significantly for significant periods before symptoms developed. And actually, I even remember at the time being a little bit skeptical about the first reports of that, because there was a lot of scientific groupthink around that. And as that became more apparent, the modelling had to adapt very quickly. So I think there are differences between contingency planning around flu in particular, which doesn't quite have those pathologies. Cliff, that's been absolutely fascinating. I sense a story that's not finished, and it may well be that in 12 months' time we need to get you back again to reflect on where we are in 12 months' time. I think you alluded to that at the end of your lecture, that actually some of the difficulties, possibly many of the difficulties as we unwind from this, are going to be as challenging as when we moved into it.
If not more so. And may I just take the opportunity to thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. It's been, certainly been a challenge for me, and I've felt very nervous about presenting here today. And I hope that I've done the lecture series justice with the perspectives that I've given today, and that the audience have found it interesting. It was a nerve-wracking experience for me, and it was a story that I've been working out how to tell, and I hope I've at least captured interest in that.
Well, judging by the questions that are still flooding in, and the audience out there, I think you've done a fantastic job, Cliff, and real thanks for communicating in this forum, which I know is difficult. It's very, very difficult giving a public lecture when you're basically looking at yourself and a screen and slides in front of you, but it's been really fascinating to hear from you. Just before we close for the rest of the audience, just to note that the next in the Grand Challenge lecture series, the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences series, is in partnership with the Race Equality lecture series, and that will be presented by Professor Kawan Bhopal. She is Professor of Education and Social Justice and Director of the Centre of Research on Race in Education at the University of Birmingham, and her lecture is entitled Competing Inequalities, Gender, Race and White Privilege in Higher Education Institutions in the UK. Now that's going to take place again, obviously, via Microsoft Teams in the same format, and that's on Thursday the 22nd of April at midday. So that's a daytime lecture, Thursday the 22nd of April at 12 o'clock, 12 midday. And again, all details are on the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences website. So that will be chaired by my colleague, Professor I think Shane. Yes, Shane's doing it. The Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences. So look forward to seeing you at that event. Thank you very much, Cliff, again, but a particular thanks to our audience. A fantastic series of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through them all. It's really difficult. I've tried to group them together as much as possible. But look forward to seeing you all at the next event, and thank you for joining us this evening. So good night. Thank you.